Hello, everyone, and welcome to Destreaming Math, Equity, Practice, and Politics. My name is Wayne Erdman, your OAME moderator for this session. We also have Peter Way, who is here as technical host. I will now read the land acknowledgement. We are gathered here for this Ontario Mathematics Conference today, both at work and in our homes, on the ancestral lands and waters of all Indigenous peoples, including First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples in Ontario, who have left their footprints on Mother Earth before us. We want to show our respect for their contributions, past and present, and recognize the role of treaty making in what is now Ontario. Hundreds of years after the first treaties were signed, they are still relevant today. We have the responsibility to honor and respect the ancestors that walked before us and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We are grateful for the opportunity to gather on these territories and work in these communities. We must work towards reconciliation between Indigenous peoples and all those who live on Turtle Island, also known as North America. I want to thank all of our sponsors, many of which you saw on the rotating slides before the presentation. Questions and answers, we ask that you use the chat feature. Our presenter will pause a few times during the presentation to answer some questions, and then at the end of the session, you will also have a chance to ask questions. Check out the session notes. I'll be posting them when our presenter starts. Check session notes, you'll be able to ask questions. I'll post that link in the chat. And the presenter has curated links to support their session. A few housekeeping items then. The session is being monitored, my mistake, is being recorded, and the recording will be available at about 24 hours after the session is over on the MCIS site until June 11th for on-demand viewing. Please ensure that your microphone is on mute and your video is off. This helps to decrease bandwidth. So if you have questions, please type them in the chat and I will ask them for you when there is a chance. Due to the limited time restrictions and anticipated high number of participants, we won't be able to address all questions in chat. Use the session notes document to type your questions to the presenter after the presentation. I'm going to now turn it over to our presenter, Jason To.
All right, thanks, Wayne. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining me today. I know that everybody's had a very long year and I appreciate you spending a little bit of time with me so that we can talk Destreaming together. So yeah, this session is called Destreaming Math, Equity, Practice, and Politics, because I think as we are all, engaging in the conversations around Destreaming, that these kinds of thorny issues and pushback and resistance is now, if it wasn't already front and center, it definitely is now, right? So I wanted to share not just the the rationale, which is I think good for everybody to hear again, and maybe to go deeper in that, and share some practice around what effective math, inclusive math looks like, would be supportive in a Destreamed classroom. What does that look like? And then also, of course, kind of dealing with all of those kinds of side issues when we're really trying to push the agenda of inclusion and anti-racism forward. So like Wayne mentioned, I'm Jason To. I am the coordinator of secondary math and academic pathways in the Toronto District School Board. So academic pathways is our in-house kind of work to challenge streaming from K to 12. So the Toronto District School Board is, we are lucky in that we have been gathering data to help us uncover things around, systemic discrimination and racism and oppression. And so I was lucky enough to take part in some professional learning. So I'm going to tell my quick story. So back in 2014, I believe, I'm going to run a parallel with The Matrix. So I'm not sure if any of you have seen that movie, but in this movie, there is a guy that doesn't know very much about the world. Actually, he knows quite a lot about the world, right? But doesn't really quite have his finger on what's going on. And so that's kind of what I was. I was a teacher that was in, like all of us, if you're teaching high school, part of a system that has things happening, but you can't really quite, like you feel something's happening, but you can't really quite put your finger on it. Then I was exposed to a teacher, in this case, a professional learning facilitated session or a series of sessions where I was told about all of these, patterns of systemic exclusion of particular groups of students. And at that point, it was like, well, now after the session, I can either, like, I have a choice now, right? Like I can either take and I never remember what color is, like the blue pill, I think, is the one that, like, you just forget, right? You can go home and you can forget everything, you pretend like it never happened, or you have this responsibility now to go deeper and to learn more. And when I did, I took the pill that said that I have to keep going. And then there was this moment, there were these actions that I decided to try to do that really awoken me to, like, all the possibilities that there are to inclusion and destreaming. Led me to be, I believe, the first school in the Toronto District School Board to go academic only in math, in a school where we were predominantly applied programming, and saw incredible gains for our students with special education needs that were always being streamed into the applied program automatically. And then when we said, nope, that's not happening anymore, we saw our students actually do better than they had ever done before, students with an IEP, and who have been typically congregated into an LD ISP program. So incredible things. And that just kind of woke me up. So this was me, thinking I knew what I was doing, realizing that what I was doing really wasn't going to work in an inclusive kind of academic only class. And so it changed, and then you had to learn, and you had to experiment, and you had to inquire professionally around practice. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about some of these things that you're seeing there. So it's been a long journey. So like I said, it was 2014 where I was involved in some learning. 2015 was when I began to challenge streaming in my own practice, and I've been on essentially a crusade, I suppose, of sharing learning and providing and supporting professional learning options for staff that are looking more into challenging streaming. So the title of this was Equity, Practice, and Politics. So I'm going to split it up into those three. So we're going to just take a very quick overview as to why we're destreaming. And what I'm going to ask you in the chat right now very quickly is for you to articulate in like 5 words or less. Why is Ontario destreaming? And I think we all have different information, different rationales that were shared with us. So I just invite you, just 5 words or less, if you can boil it down, as to why, from your perspective, we are removing streaming in grade 9 math for starters, and then moving forward into the other streams. All right. Thank you, everyone. So streaming is oppressive. kids are too young to know. So I'm assuming, yep, in terms of what they want to do. So we're talking about reaching every student. I see equity for all behind the world, right? So Ontario is the only province to stream in grade 9. Leaving the options open, dismantling systemic racism. Right. Okay. So all of these things. So I'm hearing there's the everyone. We want to kind of elevate learning for everyone, and then there's also the removal of systemic barriers for students and talk about equity and oppression. Right. So thank you, everyone. So very quickly, some data. So the TDSB has been collecting race-based data for a number of years now. And so this chart highlights our students' self-identified race according to programs of study. So here we have academic, applied, essentials, and undefined. Undefined is typically our students taking K courses, or if you have like an even applied academic split, we don't know where to put you. So I wanted to highlight a couple things. That in this data set of students in 2011-2012, in the Toronto District School Board, 12.6% of the population was Black students. However, they only made up 8.8% of the students in academic, and you can see they're overrepresented in applied and even more so in essentials programming. And that's also true of our Indigenous population. And we have a very low self-identification rate, right, for our Indigenous students. So that those numbers are an underreporting. So we're seeing that there was an overrepresentation of our most marginalized racial groups in applied and essentials programming. Of course, overrepresentation may not be a bad thing if applied and essentials programming offered, good outcomes as well. But we'll look at that later. Let's look also in terms of special education need. So in the Toronto District School Board, in the same cohort, almost 95% of students in academic programming did not have a special education need. So that's SEN. So, and this excludes gifted as an exceptionality. So only about 5% of students in the TDSB in academic programming had a special education need. That goes up to about a third of students in applied, and then it jumps to 2/3 in essentials programming. So we're seeing more and more of a special education profile as we move into applied and essentials. Income seems to also be a trend. So this is decile of income. So this is our lowest income families, and this is our highest income families. And we're seeing that for academic, the wealthier your family is, the proportion of students going into academic is higher. Whereas for applied, it's the other way around. So the lower income, the higher proportion of students in applied and essentials as well. So all of this data has led us to, there's some patterns here, right? And we don't quite know we don't know why it's happening, but something's happening here. And so one of the things that has been shown is, actually, I think I'll go here, is that the outcomes, I think, as everybody knows by now, in applied and essentials programming aren't nearly as good compared to academic programming. So this is a quote from a report that I contributed to, and it talks about streaming as an oppressive structure. So I'll read it out loud. So oppression in education involves the privileging of some and the marginalization of others through actions, inactions, or more subtly, assumptions and expectations that influence how marginalized students are treated. This oppression is supported by policies, practices, and structures. Inappropriate streaming and low teacher expectations are examples of systemic oppression and anti-Black racism in the school system. So over the weekend, I gathered, I wanted to kind of elevate voices of those that have been marginalized by streaming. And so I was able to collect a fair number of stories. Here's about 24 of adults now that have, have survived streaming structures in spite of what has been put upon them. So I'm going to invite you to just take 30 seconds to read a couple of these. And, in the chat, feel free to provide a reaction or a question or a thought or a wondering about what the stories that you've read. So I'll just give you 30 seconds to do that. There are lots of, emotions that, I see when I hear like I hated school and this was why, because of low expectations, or I was categorized to be somewhere where I never asked to be, right? And like I think someone, Christina wrote, it limits potential, right? So when we're having low expectations, and it's no coincidence that so many of these voices and these pictures are like racialized people. That tells you something, that they wanted to share this story as well. So in theory, these are our streams, and I know that they were never meant to be streams, but they are. We have, and this is thanks to the Coalition for Alternatives to Streaming in Education, which I'm a part of the steering committee, and they came up with this, nice graphic to show that academic pathways lead to university, college, apprenticeships, and workplace. So post-secondary education, I think we all recognize, can be an apprenticeship or going to college in addition to going to university. So the idea of destreaming is that we're not valuing one over the other. They're all viable post-secondary educational outcomes. But really the argument here is the pathways in which these destinations go to are broken, and they don't work nearly as well as we think they do. The applied pathway, of course, it goes to apprenticeships and college and the workplace, and the essentials pathway leads to workplace and apprenticeships as well. So you can see that that there are ways to go from applied to academic, but of course in this diagram it shows that it is actually quite difficult, right? So in theory there is this movement between streams, but in reality when we look at the data, this is TDSB data from 2011 to 2016. So the point here is that while again in theory there is this idea that if we just start in applied, put students in applied and they'll get better, and then that way they can go to a different stream like university preparation. What we see is a very lockstep for academic to university preparation to university. When we look at students who start in applied for grade 9 and 10, we're seeing a little bit of movement towards university preparation if that's what they want to do. But for the vast majority, they go to college preparation programming, which is not a bad thing if they actually go to college. And while we're seeing that many do end up applying and going to college, we're seeing that actually many of them don't even apply. So this is about college and university. We actually don't have very good data around apprenticeships. Most students end up going into apprenticeship programs in their mid-20s. So it's more of an indirect pathway in terms of what the data is saying. But this graphic is just showing about university and college entry. So we're seeing that this pathway to college that we have been actually selling to students doesn't really work. that when you go to college, actually less than half of our students are actually making it to college. And let's not forget who is disproportionately placed into the applied and college pathway. It's Black students, Indigenous students, students with special education needs, and students coming from low income families. So we've got an issue here where we've got a broken pathway being overly populated by our most marginalized students. Now, there's always this argument, especially in math, right, where we say it's better for them to do well in applied than to not do very well in academic. And when we actually take a look at the data, we're seeing that if you keep grade 6 EQAO achievement constant, let's say for groups of students, many will go to academic math, and many will go into applied math. So MPM 1D is academic math, and FM 1P is applied math. And so I'm going to highlight, this group here where, these are students, 1,438 of them that did just below provincial standard in grade 6 math. However, many of them decided to take academic math, that's fine. And then many of them decided to take applied math, which, okay. So we're seeing though, that if we highlight here, the median mark of the students in the applied class were actually higher than the median mark for the students in the academic class. And so you might think, okay, well, that's great. They're getting a higher mark. So that must lead to better outcomes. However, when we look at college and university entrance after 5 years of high school for that same group, we're seeing that the students that got a lower mark in academic were actually entering college and university at a much higher rate, almost 50% higher. So this is a fallacy, right? Where we're saying that, do well in applied, you're going to end up going to college or university. Your chances are better. And no matter how we slice it in terms of grade 6 achievement, the story is always the same. So better mark in applied. However, the translation long-term is that they don't actually make it to college or university at nearly the same rate. So there is this opportunity gap that we are seeing. I want to highlight here again that there is a discrepancy between students in academic and applied programming as a whole. So we're going to zoom out of math for a moment, and we're seeing that over 4 out of 5 students that take academic programming end up going to college or university. And again, we don't have very good data around apprenticeship, so that's why they're not part of the data set. If we look at students from the applied program, though, we're seeing less than half of our students after 5 years getting into university or college. And you might be asking, well, why is there this emphasis on going to college or university? We know from the National Board of Labor that over 70% of the jobs in the future are going to require some form of post-secondary education. And so we are trying to support students in achieving economic security. We also know that good quality education is linked as a social determinant of health. So these are actually, we're talking about health outcomes for people here. So it's not an exaggeration to say that applied programming is leading to worse lives for people down the road, okay, as a whole. So that's what the picture is telling us. And in the TDSB, when we're looking at a disproportionate number of Black students in applied and locally developed programming, that in that same vein, they are the lowest racial group in terms of post-secondary access. So, you can put 2 and 2 together, and we're seeing here that, I'm seeing a question here. So this is a cohort. So these are students from grade 9 that start in 2011, and we're looking at their outcome in 2016. So we're following one group of students over 5 years. So we're seeing that in that group that our Black students were not accessing college or university at the same rate. Right? Now, even if they do make it into post-secondary education, is the college pathway actually supporting students when they're going into college? So this is the college math project data that was about 10 years old. And in the last 3 bars here, these are students that entered college. So these are students that are at college that entered college having taken university preparation math courses. So MCR 3U, it's 11 functions, and any grade 12 university prep. And you notice that this blue bar means they got good grades, which is a C or above, and an at risk is a D and below. So for students that took university preparation math when they entered college, over 4 out of 5 of them were getting good grades. Now, let's go to the flip side here. And when we look at students that went to college, having taken college preparation, we're seeing that only just over half of them are getting good grades, and almost half of them are at risk of failing, right? Let's take that in for a moment. We have been telling students that, hey, if you take 11 college and 12 college math, that you'll do fine in college for math, and that's just not true. And so when we're seeing that best outcomes are students that are taking the highest levels of math, I think it's incumbent then of all of us to say, well, how do we make sure that we are providing the opportunities for students to get to that highest level and to maintain that highest level of math so that they are most successful in math down the road? And so that leads to this topic of destreaming. We are saying now we have set up pathways for students that are actually not supporting them. I want to put a plug for my destreaming choice board that I've made, and I'm just going to throw that in the chat. So if you want to know more about destreaming, because I don't want to just take up all the time talking about the rationale, you can take a look at that. And there are 15 things that you can choose from. There's webinars, there's a book, there's a blog, there's a report, there's articles, there's podcasts, there's a rap video. There's lots of things there that'll, I think, engage you in terms of learning more, and feel free to share that with your staff that are probably still if you are in the beginning stages of talking about destreaming, that's kind of important to deepen your knowledge base. So at this point, I don't know if there are any questions in the chat. Okay, so I'm just this is TDSB data that I'm sharing. The college math project, of course, is Ontario-based data, but most of the data is from TDSB, only because we have we're fortunate to have been gathering race-based data for a long time. We don't have data. I don't have data handy about adult ed, Katie, and I think those are how are we sure? Oh, how do we know destreaming makes a difference? Okay, so great question. When we look at, I think one of the resources is where is it? Towards race equity in education. We are seeing that there is, and just looking at the stories from members of the Black community on Twitter that are just at odds about this system that they've been fortunate to kind of break away from and to survive from. But there are so many that we know are not actually making it through. And when we are saying that, will destreaming lead to better outcomes? Well, the Black community and the Indigenous community have been asking us to destream for decades. They see it as a barrier and as an option. And we know also from jurisdictions, and I'll share with you in a moment, that when they have destreamed, that it has led to success for students. But I mean, keep in mind, and I think that's where that's the great segue, is that a structural change like destreaming needs to come with a pedagogical shift as well. So for the sake of time, I'm gonna move on. But if we have time, I'll take some of those questions. If not, then if you can copy paste them into the session notes, that'd be wonderful. So practice is the number 2 area here. And so how should math classes operate in destreamed environments? So I'm going to share with you a sort of a framework for equity in mathematics that was shared by Rochelle Gutierrez over at the University of Illinois. And she highlights there is this dominant axis of equity that we've been talking about in terms of access and achievement. Access being access to high quality math instruction, to the best quality teachers, to equipment, to textbooks, all the like. Achievement speaks to how well you're doing on your report card, how well you do on standardized assessments, that kind of thing. So we have been spending a lot of time on those two things. And while those are very important, there are also two elements that are typically ignored, which is about identity and power, which she labels as the critical axis. So identity meaning building students' identities as math learners, having the math instruction reflect who they are in terms of their identities and their lived realities. Does the learning experience allow students to learn more about themselves and their own cultures and histories, as well as the cultures and histories of others? The power aspect of this axis speaks to power in terms of the classroom and in terms of the learning. So who is speaking more in a math class? Is it the teacher or is it the students? Who's doing the math more? Is it the teacher or is it the students? Who is creating the math? Is it teachers or students? So identifying and addressing identity and power issues in mathematics is just as important as access and achievement. So we need to deal with all four of these things. The NCTM has a research brief about equity-based teaching. And I'll just read the quote that I really love. It's that equity-based mathematics teaching means practices that take into account the ways mathematics education perpetuates oppressive norms and therefore actively seeks to erase them so that all students can participate meaningfully in mathematics learning and create their own mathematical knowledge. So there is an acknowledgement that mathematics education, in terms of some of its practices and structures, actually perpetuates oppression. So we have to take a look and critically reflect on what some of those things are. And I think many of you probably already acknowledge that what some of those are. But it takes some deep diving to really take, and a good hard look in the mirror, like I've had to do, to think about what are some of the things that I thought that I've been doing that was helping students that was actually silencing them or making them feel, lesser as a math learner. So the main approaches that research and action have told us is that, for one, differentiating instruction is so important. There was a study from the University of Chicago that looked at Chicago schools, public schools, where they had destreamed and then restreamed. So they were able to make some causal effects and some conclusions. And one of them was differentiating. If you didn't differentiate instruction and maintain classroom control, that you were more likely to exacerbate inequities as opposed to closing them. So if you de-streamed without differentiating instruction, you're actually going to make things worse. So this is my sort of cautionary tale to you, is that differentiating instruction is critical. It's in the Learning for All document. If you haven't taken a look at it, DI researches back in the 80s and 90s. Carol Ann Tomlinson is sort of the guru of differentiated instruction. We want to take a look at that. There's a book, Differentiated Instruction, or How to Differentiate Instruction for Academically Diverse Learners, which is great, which is it's a good general book that you might want to take a look at to, dive in as an entire staff, for instance. But in a nutshell, teachers can differentiate through content, right? So what are you teaching? The process in which you're teaching, the products that you're asking students to create to demonstrate their learning, as well as the environment in which we are having students learn. And we differentiate according to students' readiness, interest, and learning profile. Now, the one that everyone is freaking out about in terms of destreaming is about readiness, right? So we are now inviting a wider range of student readiness into a space where we are teaching the highest levels of math. right? So I think we have to be very cognizant of the readiness, but also recognize that we can differentiate through interest as well. How do we capture students' attention and interest in our math class, as well as reflecting the learning profiles of our students? So what are their learning needs? So another key approach is universal design for learning. So having multiple means of representation, multiple means for students' action and expression, and then multiple means for engagement. So when I think of UDL, I think of the ramp, like a ramp to a door in a building, right? That we know that that's an accessibility piece, that there are those that use mobility devices to go, and bypass stairs. But we know that those ramps are also used by parents that are pushing a stroller, or a caretaker that is, wheeling a really big bin, right? And so that ramp that was designed as an accessibility tool is something that everybody can actually use and benefit from, right? So that's the essential for some, good for all argument. And the thing that I want to ask you is, well, what kinds of pedagogical ramps are we building for students? So that is, how are we making our learning more accessible to our students? Okay, and thinking about the scaffolding and the supports that are essential for some learners, but are actually helpful for everyone. Okay, so think about those pedagogical ramps, or also the non-ramps that we're making. What are some of the barriers that we are putting forward to students, right? And so thinking about it from an accessibility standpoint was a big learning piece for me. The third and final framework that I want to share with you today to support destreamed math classes is culturally responsive pedagogy. So there's a monograph from the ministry. And these are 6 characteristics of a culturally responsive teacher. There's an understanding of sociocultural consciousness, high expectations, teachers' desire to make a difference, having a constructivist approach, having a deep knowledge of your students to support your culturally responsive teaching practices, where we're using students' prior knowledge as a resource for their learning. Right? So take a deep dive into that. So you might be thinking, okay, Jason, those are grand ideas. What does that actually look like in a math classroom, you might say? So this is by far not an exhaustive list, but these are the things that I and my colleagues that have been working on destreaming in the TDSB see as critical pieces that you don't have to do them all, of course, but these are the components of a successful, inclusive, differentiated, culturally responsive math class that will support a destreamed environment. So DI looks like open questions and parallel tasks. So Marion Small has a book that talks all about that, right? More good questions, or good questions if you're in JI. Small group instruction is a big one. Universal design for learning, if you're thinking about spiraling. So spiraling is an integral part of providing access for students and supporting their learning in a research informed, evidence-based way, as well as computer algebra systems. And I'll go into some details about some of these, but I can't do it all. So it's going to be a bit of a menu. So there is this idea of going a mile wide and an inch deep, or an inch wide and a mile deep. Well, I'm going mile wide, guys, today, as just a spark, as something for you to take away and to think a little bit more about. Okay, so if you're feeling that, if I talk about some of these things and you're like, I want to know more, that's the point. And so hopefully, when I talk about some of these things, that you'll take some time to think a little bit more about like, how do I learn more about that? So culturally responsive pedagogy, I listed 5 practices for orchestrating productive math discussions. That's Smith and Stein. And so we see that as being responsive because we're using students' work, and having their voice drive learning. Building thinking classrooms. And although that, I don't think was designed as a culturally responsive framework. I mean, the elements of it are more implicit in terms of its equity lens. So I think it's important to, take that and apply an equity and anti-racist, anti-oppressive lens to a thinking classroom framework to make it work. And then math for social justice. So, I think in the math, especially at OAME, there's been a lot of stuff around thinking classrooms. So I'm not going to go into big details, but, in my classroom, which is the picture on the bottom left-hand corner, so it's this one, I worked in what was the neediest school in the TDSB. So we have measures in terms of how, quote unquote needy our schools are in terms of parental income and education, in terms of income, there's other measures I can't remember, but in the Jane and Finch community, which I was fortunate and blessed to serve, that this streaming thought would like it couldn't be done, and we did it, and it was wonderful. But thinking about the thinking classroom framework, absolutely. Does that work? You betcha. Okay? Because it elevates the learning expectations, right, for students. One of the things I want to spend a little bit of time on is computer algebra system. And so, I made a GIF of solving an equation using a GeoGebra computer algebra system. So I'm here modeling how you can, emphasize procedures, and have a technology assist with the implementation of the procedure, right? And having students apply their conceptual understanding, aided by tech. So I, last year in the classroom, taught academic math to students that were identified with a mild intellectual disability. They were being automatically streamed into applied and locally developed programming. As an ardent destreamer, I thought that was criminal. And so I said, nope, we're not doing that anymore. We're going to teach academic math. I learned, however, working with students in that class, that they, had issues with procedures, right, and fluency in that. So then I didn't have computer algebra systems in the classroom yet. I dusted them off. We had TI Inspire calculators, and so we used that, and it was a game changer for so many of my students. So we worked on solving an equation with a fractional coefficient, right, grade 9 academic math. And they were employing strategies just like this, where they were identifying what they needed to do, and the technology helped them with it, right? Now, we know that, before people are like, wow, okay, technology and math don't mix, right? Well, I want to share with you this interesting quote, that we have been using technology for millennia in terms of mathematics. Notches on objects such as bones or pieces of wood have been used for keeping numbers in memory in many parts of the world. A small bone about 11,000 years old that was found in Congo has 3 columns with in total 167 tally marks. The Incas used sets of connected knotted strings for bookkeeping and taxation purposes. In some cultures, warriors made cuts on their own bodies or those of their wives to keep track of how many enemies they had slain. So it could be a heck of a lot worse for students to be, using different technology in math, right? So we have always been doing this. The technology that was in front of people was what they were using to do mathematics. And so this is no different. So I see this as a way to, to what Rochelle Gutierrez mentions about rehumanizing mathematics. So we're just doing what our ancestors have been doing, using the tools that were in front of them to engage in meaningful mathematics. One of the things that I wanted to highlight is this need, and I would say a need, to use mathematics in real world situations to uncover social injustice and to help develop students' critical consciousness. Destreaming is sort of a refocus in terms of what schooling is about, which is fulfilling a democratic promise, right, for students. It is about this idea that public education is meant for everyone in equal ways. And when we're destreaming, we're actually not doing that. And so it is sort of again, a rejuvenation of the purpose of schooling. And so a purpose of schooling is to develop informed and critically conscious citizen. So one example that I wanted to share with you of an activity that I've done over the years to develop critical consciousness is this idea of looking at maps. And I have a provocative title there about, can a map be racist? And so let me ask you in the chat, I'm going to share two different map projections, because as you may know, it's actually impossible to represent a 3D, a sphere on a 2D surface without some sort of reconciling of space or distance. And so I'm going to ask you, which one looks more familiar to you in terms of, the maps that you've seen representing the world? Is it the Mercator projection, or is it the Winkle triple projection? And if I were smarter, I would have made a Zoom poll, but I'm going to ask you in the chat to just let me know which one actually, if you closed your eyes and you imagined the world on a map, which one would that be? So there's a bit of a mix, right? Actually, more people are saying Mercator. I think those are the ones that are typically the one that you pull down, in your grade 6 class to point, at like where you're going to go on vacation, right? So we then went on an investigation. So I assigned groups a continent, either it's Africa or North America, and either Africa in the Mercator projection or North America, or in the Winkle triple projection. And so they would look like this, and they would keep their relative size. Okay. And so students were asked to, like, how would you find the area of that, like on a piece of paper, right? Because we were just doing it on paper. And so there are different strategies that you could do, right? You can cut it up. This is of South America because I wanted to show it as a exemplar. And we talk about, well, okay, so it's taking up a little bit of water, but then you're giving up a little bit of land over there, so it kind of evens out. So we're using this idea of approximation, right? But then we also had these pattern blocks that you can use to cover up the map, and then you can just use the measurements that students would measure them, of course, but I just wanted to show you what some of these are, and so that they would then be able to calculate the area of Africa or North America on their paper. So that's what they did. And you can tell just by eyeballing it, right? That on the Mercator projection, North America is larger than Africa. But then in the Winkle triple projection, Africa seems to be bigger than North America. So we're like, what's going on here, right? So let me ask you, if I told you that North America was 24 million square kilometers and change, what do you think Africa is? What in terms of area? And don't Google it. I know you're at home, and I know you can Google it. But I'm gonna trust you not to do that, based on your hunch, right? Your intuition, your guess. What do you think the area of Africa would be in millions of square kilometers? Okay. So I'm seeing a guess of there's 20, 40, 35, 30. So we're talking about for real now, Joe. So, I mean, there is I'm harping on Dan Meyer. There's a right answer to this one, right? So I'm seeing a guess of 17 million. So some people are saying that it's going to be smaller, and some people are thinking it's going to be bigger, right, than North America. So the actual answer is that Africa is a larger continent than North America by land, for real. So then we take a look at, and that usually blows people's minds. I love this graphic that takes a look at really, you can fit so many of these really large countries into the entire continent of Africa. Then we, someone inevitably asked the question, well, why is that important? Like, why do we care, right? Why would we care that Africa is larger than North America? Well, Salvatore Natali, who was the from the National Council of Social Studies, who was the from the National Council of Social Studies, once said that in our society, we unconsciously equate size with importance and even power. So when we think of a continent like Africa as being smaller than of North America, there are some implicit kind of ideas and thoughts that come with that. But also what's more important is that we think of maps as truths, right? Like someone made a map, but maps are social constructions. And so if we can deconstruct maps as being biased or as being inaccurate, right? Something that's seen as truth, what other truths, quote unquote, could we disrupt? And so then you can start to investigate all sorts of other things, right? And so that's how we start to develop critical consciousness, right? Like we need people to think critically. And so why not disrupt what was once seen as a truth in terms of maps, right? Okay, so that's just one example that I share with you. I mentioned before that spiraling, and I think, in the OAME math community, I think many of us, know what spiraling is. So starting off with some sort, surface level understanding, and then connecting those ideas by going through the curriculum again, but making connections and going deeper into the concepts, and then going through again one more time, making more connections and going deeper into the concepts. So in my practice, and for those that, kind of went along with me to spiral an academic only math program, that it allowed for a really great soft landing for students to enter grade 9 academic math. That, when we're looking at very, like just concepts, right? At a surface level, that students felt, that it wasn't threatening at all. And then it gave them the foundation, the time that they needed to really shore up some of those ideas and to go deeper and deeper. Okay. But we also know that spiraling in terms of like cognitive learning science is telling us that, spacing out your practice, spacing out your learning leads to greater retention in knowledge, right? So, and learning. A highlight of destreamed math classes, or a strategy that's really important, is small group instruction. So it's in elementary classes, highlight a secondary class there as well. The high impact instructional practices in math say that it's such a powerful practice that you really should be doing it every day. Okay, so that's a bread and butter strategy in a destreamed classroom. I'm going to talk super fast about assessment because I want to get to the politics bit of this. But remember that growing success is saying that, the benchmark or the provincial standard is a level 3, which means that you should be demonstrating considerable knowledge and content, right? I want to dissect growing success just a little bit to tell you that students that only demonstrate some knowledge of content, okay, some, right? If I told you that you only know some things about teaching, you probably wouldn't be very flattered by that comment. However, that same level should be getting students a 60%, okay, or a level 2. You can actually pass the course and get a credit by demonstrating less than some understanding, right? By showing limited understanding of content. And that should be enough to get a 50. And the reason why I want to highlight this is that John Hattie's research, right, all the meta-analyses have told us that pretty much anything a teacher does supports student learning. It's the ones that really support student learning are the strategies that really we should be spending our time on. But pretty much anything supports students. There's only a few strategies that harm students in their learning. And one of them is retention, meaning failing students. So while we believe, again, one of those things that we think helps but doesn't. If we think that one of our solutions to destreaming is just fail the kids that are struggling, we are doing a huge disservice. And again, is that one of those oppressive acts in mathematics that we do? What I argue is that if a student is demonstrating a limited understanding of the content, that they should be granted the credit. We're not super thrilled about it, but they should be granted the credit to move on and to be allowed to continue their investigation and consolidation of their learning in the next grade. We've seen trajectories of students that were getting a level 1 in grade 9 to get a level 2 in grade 10 to a level 3 in grade 11 and 12. Okay, so this is not a death sentence if a student is getting 50% or 50 something in grade 9. Okay, there is not necessarily a causal relationship that moves forward. Okay, with good instruction, of course. So that leads us to this idea that we're not ranking and sorting students, right? That's not the purpose of our assessment. We really should be triangulating, like Growing Success is telling us, with products and observations as well as conversations. But they can look different, right? Different people. And I think Alita's here. I'm not sure if she's here, but thank you for the graphic. I know this is shared, far and wide in the TDSB, because this is such an important part of, anti-oppressive assessment practices. So I hope that there's something there, again, some idea that interests you. I hope you take just 5 seconds to write that down, not in the chat. You can just write it down in your notebook or somewhere. You can text it to yourself, but something there to look deeper at. Okay, I'm going to spend the last few minutes, looking at the last part, which is the politics aspect. So there are 3 things according to, let me get back to here. This is based on this book that was a mentor text during my professional learning around, it's called Detracking for Excellence and Equity. Detracking is the American term for destreaming. And so this is a case study of a jurisdiction in New York State that decided to destream their entire school system. It's a small school system, but a system nonetheless. So she, the author, identified 3 Ps that led to a perpetuation of streaming. And one of them is prejudice. So having biased notions of ability, having a harmful narrative of race and class and intelligence. So for instance, we are seeing an overrepresentation of Black students in applied programming. That has created a very dangerous narrative that links race with perceived intelligence. And then also ignoring that there's intersectionality of marginalized populations. So for instance, we know that there is a huge intersection of Black students with, identified with a special education need informally, right? So, and like, what is the experience of those students, right? That's different than if they were just, a Black student that wasn't placed on an IEP. We have to be clear that, when we're talking about anti-oppression and streaming is rooted in white supremacy. And now I'm not talking about the overt white supremacy that you're seeing on the top of there, like you're seeing lynching and KKK and using the N-word. We're talking about the covert white supremacy, the stuff that's still seemingly socially acceptable. And so we need to put a stop to streaming, because it has been based on notions, unfair and incorrect notions of ability linked with disability, race, and other forms of identities. So what can we do? Disaggregate your data, right? So that's why I shared that information with you today, and round it with anecdotes, because some people will just be like, oh, I can poke holes in your data, but you can't poke holes in people's lived realities and their stories. Challenge these notions of ability, and elevate the voices of marginalized groups, which is one of the things I just tried to do with the Twitter stories. A second thing is prestige. Teacher prestige is a big thing. So we sometimes, get a lot of pushback from teachers that only teach AP and IB courses, or or they're the only ones that have to do it, right? Because they're the only ones trained. But then they are typically teachers that hold on to streaming structures. Parent prestige is also a real thing. So does destreaming mean a loss of academic prestige? Now, we know that there are parents everywhere that will do anything to make their kids succeed, okay? Now, we have to be very clear that we can counter that by asking critical questions, okay? So if we're looking at AP and IB programming, for instance, if that's your huge streaming structure, ask those in the community and those that are teaching those classes, for whom do those specialized programs serve, or whom do they not, right? We can teach rich and high quality math in a destream class. You have to provide high support though. The high bar, high expectations come with high supports, and an expectations that students then can succeed. And then wanting to feel special is not a bad thing, right? As a parent, of course, I want my kid to be special. Thanks, Wayne. I see the warning. So provide those opportunities for students to feel special. Math contests, science fairs, all of those things that you can put on a kid's resume and make them feel really special and provide them with honors. Prestige shouldn't hijack our school system, bottom line. All right, and the last P that holds weight in in streaming is teacher power and parental power. So teachers have always had power to move students and and dictate what's in their classrooms, and they don't want that being taken away. Okay, I'm not saying for all, but just the ones that are the most ardent pushbackers, right? And then there's also parental power as well. So what can you do about that? Have allies. So engage your parent council in the learning. If you can get your parent council on board, then those are the parent voices that can then talk to the parents that may not agree. Empower the teachers who support destreaming. So you have to have those allies, okay, and elevate them, make them part of your team. Of course, share facts, listen politely to concerns, of course, even if they're coded with racial and class bias. Okay, so those students don't belong in that, right? Who are those students, right? We have an ear for that. Address the issues as best as you can, but you have to stand your ground. Okay, so I have 3 P's that support destreaming. I'm just going to go through that real quick. Planning, patience, and perseverance. So plan. I know so many of you are just thrown into destreaming, but come up with a professional learning plan. Okay, have patience. This is going to take a lot of time. Streaming has happened for over 150 years. Okay, it's not going to take one semester and this is all going to go away. This is going to take people. This is going to take time. And don't believe that there are teachers that cannot move. Okay, someone always told me, don't water the rocks. Focus on those that can actually move. There are no rocks. Everybody can move, and you have to believe, just like how we believe that that students can succeed, you have to believe that all teachers can succeed as well. And perseverance, push through without pushing people over, and address concerns, but don't compromise on your principles, because you have to hold firm. Okay, so I have to rush through the politics part. If you have any questions, I don't know, Wayne, I'm happy to stay just to answer some questions. I don't want to leave. I don't know if that's allowed. If you have a question but you got to go, please put it in the session notes, and I'm happy to answer them via email. If you want to stay connected, I'm on social media, or you can send me an email. And yeah, I'm always happy to talk destreaming at all hours of the day. So thank you. Sorry for rushing through things, but I tried to kind of pack things in with a captive audience as much as I can.